Greetings and welcome to this tutorial on data tables inside of UiPath Studio. As always, we will begin with a new project starting as a process. So go ahead and click on Process under New Project and call this one Data Tables. For your path and location, go ahead and continue with the same spots that we've been working with up until this point. And for a description, playing around with data tables. Go ahead and hit create. So data tables up front sound very complex and very confusing. The first thing that I want to allude to with data tables is they're actually nothing more than a very unique and maybe borderline special type of variable in this case. It's simply a variable, and the data type happens to be data table. What's unique about these variables is they are very reminiscent to an Excel spreadsheet. And when we get into the activity, you'll start to see some of those parallels as to the Excel spreadsheet. So really anything that you can do inside of an Excel spreadsheet, you can do in a roundabout way when you're working with a data table. You can really allow these things to get as complex as you desire and obviously need for your automation. In this tutorial, we're not going to get into a lot of the super advanced methods and techniques, but we'll at least give you a solid introduction so you'll be well on your way when it comes to working with data tables. So you could even arguably say there's some correlations to it if you're familiar with relational databases. So SQL Server, Microsoft Access, if you're used to the Office suite, Postgres, etc. There are a few parallels, and we'll actually cover one of those parallels inside of our demo here as we were talking about data tables. So go ahead and open up your main workflow, and let's get started. So the first activity that I would want to do is go to our Activities tab here, simply type in data tables, or data table. And you'll notice there are a lot of activities as they pertain to the use of a data table inside of UiPath Studio. We're going to cover a handful of these. We obviously don't have enough time to cover each and every single item in this list. But hopefully as we bring some of the activities in, you'll be able to draw those parallels to some of the other activities, and how do you customize the activity to meet the specific need that you might have for your particular automation. In order to get started and begin working with our data tables, we obviously need to build a data table. Recall with the activities window, if you hover over any of the activities, it will just give you a brief description as to what that specific activity does. So as we hover over build data table, you'll see it says creates a data table according to a specified schema, and we are going to build that specified schema here in this tutorial. So go ahead and grab build data table and drag that activity over. And notice right up front, there aren't a lot of properties that are readily available to us other than an output that says output as type argument creating a data table. So what we're going to do is in our demo tutorial here is have a little customer and customer address type database that we're going to use, obviously data tables inside UiPath Studio to pull this demonstration off. So our first data table, remember, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, they're nothing more than a variable. Remember, variables hold a single item. In this case, a data table holds a single table, hence data table. It holds one table of data. So think tables, think Excel spreadsheets. think rows and columns of data. And that's what a data table provides us with from a capability point of view. So with that said, it being nothing more than a variable, if I do a control K here, notice it says create variable. I want to create a new variable here called DT underscore implying data table. This is a data table variable. I want to call this one customers and hit enter. When I hit enter, notice in my variables tab, I now have a new data table. This variable type of system.data.data table called DT customers. Again, the scope of it being inside of sequence. Notice there are no other properties here to begin playing around with. But if I click on the data table button, you're finally going to have your first little glimpse into what a data table looks like. And I'm going to expand this out so I have a little bit more room to demonstrate what it is that we're trying to do. When you first come into this activity for the very first time on a build data table activity, you'll notice UiPath is trying to be helpful here and get you kind of a templated view as to what a data table looks like and how it's structured. What you notice here is they have a 2-column data table, and if you look really close, they already have a sample record loaded in here, text in column 1 and a number 1 in column 2, demonstrating that all the data in column 1 is of type string, and then column 2 being of type int32 or a single number, whole number value. What I always try to do, best practice here, in my opinion, is to come in and delete your row here. It's nice of UiPath to give us a row of data, but we're going to populate the row of data, so we don't need this. So we simply hit the remove row. Again, I'm providing this for just a little proof of concept demonstration, but they do this every single time. As you get into UiPath, consistently, this is something that kind of slows you down. You got to delete the row, but then go ahead and delete the 2 columns here. So the little X in the top right corner of each allows me to remove the column. So at this point, our data table is completely blank. We have not defined any columns of data at this point in time. So to get started adding columns, that's where this plus in the top left corner comes into play. Add a new column. When we do this, you're prompted with a little wizard window here. What do you want to call this new column? I want to call this one customer ID. And we'll be really boring and simple. Make customer ID a number. And in this case, I do not want to have a null values. Null values, recall, is the absence of any data whatsoever in your, in this case, a cell inside of the customer ID column. I want to make sure that there's always a value there. So it indicates whether null values are allowed in this column for the rows that belong to the table. Since this is a unique ID, I want to go ahead and tell it to auto increment, so it'll actually start at 0 and count its way up. I want to make sure that this value is unique. There's no duplicates. Every customer has their own ID. And obviously, as I do that, the max length value goes away. So customer ID, notice this is all the different variables that we're accustomed to having. Each cell or each column of data is able to have its own specific type assigned to it or attached to it. In this case, being a customer ID, in this case, I want to make it a number. Go ahead and hit OK. We've now officially added our first column to our new data table. Obviously, customer ID alone gives you no context or information about a customer. So I'm going to hit the plus again. Customer name is a appropriate column here. Obviously, customer name is of type string, so I don't need to make any changes there. I want to go ahead and say we can have null values. And what's cool, the other one that we did not talk about is a default value. So if you ever wanted to ensure a column always has the same value assigned to it unless otherwise overridden, you have that ability here. Again, we talked about unique, making sure that this column has a unique value across all the other rows. Then max length gives you a little bit more control over how many characters can be added to a specific column. You know, a single row, single column, how many characters can go into that particular cell. Think, you know, a Excel spreadsheet again. Think of an individual cell. It's saying how many characters max are allowed in this specific cell. I want to go ahead and leave it at -1, which says there is no maximum length. Customer name as string. It's just to do a bit of a demonstration here. Let's add a new column called is account late. So maybe it's like a billing type scenario. You know, we're being able to track is the customer account in a late status or not, yes or no. And as I say yes or no, that would imply that we want to have a Boolean value, a yes, no, true, false type indicator for this specific record. So at this rate, we'll go ahead and say no values are fine. We obviously can't auto increment a Boolean value. We're not going to worry about having a default value. We're going to make sure we specify a value. Obviously, you can have multiple, so having a unique here would be very pointless, and obviously max length as well is not something that we can adjust. So is account late as a Boolean, go ahead and allow null values, it's fine. Notice the account late gives you a checkbox. It's either checked yes it is true, or unchecked false no it is not, in this case being a late account. And the last column I want to play with is what is the customer's birthday. So we'll simply call this column birthday. Now birthday, there is a data type out there that allows us to put date and timestamps in a column. Notice by default the data types are not there. So I need the ability to browse for a new data type that's not in the existing list. And I want to look for one called date time. Anytime you're in, again, the window looking for data types, what I always highly encourage folks to do is to look for the MS Core lib line down here. Microsoft Core Library is what this is standing for. And you'll notice there's a system, and the very first one in our list here is talking about date time. This type of data stores, you know, your, how to say this, month, year, and day type information, as well as hours, minutes, and seconds, obviously AM, PM. The reason I'm using this is the date time actually allows for computations, being able to do date differences and calculations as it pertains to differences in time. So once you have date time selected, click OK. You'll notice the data type shows up as system.datetime now. We'll go ahead and say no values are fine. Everything else we'll pretty much leave alone. So go ahead and hit OK. Now we have officially built our columns to our data table. We're at a point now we need to just generically load some data so we have something to play with. So with the example that they gave us before, you should be able to click in the box here. You'll notice the 0 automatically populates because of the auto incrementer that we set on the customer ID. So at this rate, go ahead and follow along with me, make up whatever names you personally prefer, or you can follow along with my exact example here if you desire. It's up to you. But the one thing I want to make sure is you get some values in here that we were able to do a little bit of playing around with some of the dates maybe, or obviously the Boolean values, being able to do some filtering of our data table later on. So make sure you got a few that are checked, a few that aren't checked. Make sure you have a few that have the same month, maybe a few that have the same year. The one thing with the date time, notice it puts a midnight timestamp. I'm not too concerned about putting an explicit, you know, down to the second when was the individual born. So we're going to leave everybody at a 12 o'clock a.m. timestamp. We're simply going after what is their actual birthday down to the date, month, and year. I should say month, day, and year, their actual birth date. So Sally Smith, she is not late. And we'll say hers is on 1/1/2000. Notice my auto incrementer is counting each time I add a new record. If you're curious, this little gray box, what this is actually trying to indicate a null value here. Remember, a null value, it's not so much as a yes or no, true or false. A null value is neither. It's the absence of anything. There is not a true, and there is not a false value. That's why we're getting this little black dot instead of a checkbox or a white box. So notice that you're able to tab through. You can't return back to a null value here, though, unless you were to delete the record and recreate it. So going back, and I'm going to make this one that he is late, 2/2/1998. Steve, how about Jane Doe? We'll have her not late, 2/28/1962. And we'll add one more record. Mike Jones is late, 10/12/1962. There is our beginnings of our data table here. And go ahead and hit OK. And you'll notice at this point, nothing's really changed on this side, data table. Once we click on it, notice if we do, all of our data is viewable. Obviously, if we run our automation here, absolutely nothing will happen. We've not told you I have to export anything out. The data table is there. We just didn't export any of the data to where we can see it, which makes for an excellent point that why don't we look at our options over here under data table. You'll notice there is a for each row, and we talked about this one back when we looked at a for each loop. For each row is a very specific type of loop that only works for a data table data type. So it functions exactly like the for each loop did when we were looking at an array a couple of activities prior, a couple lessons prior. So this way, let's bring the for each row loop in. In this case, you do not want to use simply the for each loop. It will not work, at least natively it will not work. If you're working with a data table and need to walk through every record of your data table, that's where this for each row loop comes into play. So as you hover over, it says executes an action once for each row in the data table provided. So the data table provided, notice our input here, if I type in the name of our data table here or here, both are the same. So if I type in DT underscore, you notice I only have one data table or customers table again. As soon as I click off of it, you'll notice the DT customer shows up here and in my list. Exactly like the for each loop for an array or any type of list, type data type. What this is doing is actually going to return an entire row from our data table. So looking at our example, for each row loop, it's going to start with our first record here of 0. Our first row, it's going to return back 0 John Doe, true for account late, and then 8/31/1975 birth date. When it goes to the end and comes back up again, then it goes on to the next row, turns 1, Sally Smith, false, and then 1/1/2000 until we get to the bottom of the list. So in order to be able to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and bring another write line activity in here. So cancel your search and start looking for write line in the activities. Bring this inside, make sure you're inside the body of your loop. At this rate, the way we are able to denote what we want printed, we're able to leverage the row up here to get into specific columns. Notice as soon as I do an open parenthesis, it says column as data column. What this is looking for is what is the name of the column. And in this case, customer ID was 1. I have to do a .toString here. And let's go ahead and return the customer name. So let's do a concatenated value here. I want to go to my 3 dots here so we can see it all on one screen. Do a plus dash quote plus, and if I do row in quotes, make sure these are in quotes, customer name, end quote, .toString again. Oh, typo here, row, open parenthesis, customer toString, there we go. So this is what is in my right line now. I'm going to print out the value that's in the row for the customer ID column. And just to delineate the two, I'm going to put a hyphen or a dash. And then for that same row that I'm currently on right here, return back to me the customer name value. And then just to make sure I've got this right, I have customer space ID, customer space name. It has to match exactly like what we have here. So customer space ID is right, and then customer space name. If for some reason we had a typo or we fat fingered something and the column names did not match correctly or exactly here as they do in our data table, you're going to find that you'll have an error when your automation attempts to run. So at this rate, with the right line here, I want to attempt to rerun my automation, and we should now have a value for each record in our output window, and I do. There's the John Doe, Sally, Steve, Jane, and Mike, starting with 0 through 4. All right, so one other thing that we can do, so at this point we're ready to begin playing around with a handful of the other data table related activities. So I want to go back to my search here and say data table. The next activity that I want to be able to demonstrate here in our tutorial is this idea of adding a new data row to our existing data table. And in order to do this, I want to drag this add data row. I want to place it immediately underneath our build data table. And what you'll notice with this activity in particular, it's allowing me to pass in 3 different input arguments here. One being an array row, which is, in my opinion, is the easiest one. We've got another data type out there called data row that actually allows you to pass in a data row directly into this activity to insert a new row or a new record into our existing data table. And obviously the data table here is saying what data table do you want to add data to in the way of a new row of data. So obviously the answer to this one's pretty straightforward. Hopefully we're going to add data to the customers table. On the input side, you'll notice here it says an array of objects to be added to the data table. This implies that we need to be able to do, and I hit the 3 dots next to array row, we are going to specify an actual array here. Remember, arrays use open and closing curly brackets or braces. So I did a open and I did a close. You notice I have no errors. In this case, I'm adding a completely blank row, which I definitely do not want to do. Unfortunately, we talked about the customer ID having an auto incrementer. The auto incrementer does not work here, so we have to specify the 5. So recall the 5 was the customer ID column. What this is expecting is us to pass in an array for each value of the array. So each indexed item, if you will, is expecting a, how do I want to say this? Each index value, so 0, the 0 index goes to the customer ID column. The first indexed value goes to customer name. The second indexed value goes to are they late? And then the third index value going to their birthday. So in this case, I have to actually specify the 5. It's an integer. So notice I do not need to put that in quotes. Now remember, an array is split by commas. So 5 comma, the next column is of type string. I want to add a guy by the name of Mike Miller here, just at random. Let's have the string was how Mike Miller was set. I type in another comma to get to the next column. Remember that was the column for are they late? It's a Boolean value. Notice I also do not need commas here. And then finally another comma to get to the very last column. And let's give Mike a birth date. And this is expected to be in double quotes. Notice here I do not need to specify a time value here. It will be like we did a moment ago, and it'll immediately, without a value passed in, assume a value of midnight, 12 o'clock, 0000 a.m. to 12 o'clock midnight on the dot. Once you have this, go ahead and hit OK. You'll notice we have no errors. We've now added a new array row here of 5 Mike Miller, false, and then 1/2/2002 for his birthday. If we rerun our automation here, notice right now we have 0 through 4 and Mike Jones. When we rerun now, we should have the same list because these values again are still in the activity of build data table, but we've now added a 5th indexed row, or technically a 6th item, to the list. In this case, we should see Mike Jones show up with an ID value of 5. And there we go. Got Mike Jones followed by our new record from the add data row activity of Mike Miller. So we've added our first handful of records in the build data table. Then all of a sudden we went through and used the add data row method, and then stayed right inside of our same for each loop that we had just a moment ago. So the other thing that we should be able to play around with is the ability to add a new data column. So being able to extend our data table a bit. So right after we add a new data row, let's go ahead and add a new data column. And as this one implies, this is allowing us to add a new column to our database, or I should say our data table, not database. The new column name, so it says right here, what's the name of the new column going to be? Just for demonstration perspective here, I want to go ahead and call this column customer ID times 3, so an X3. What I want to do is a demonstration of how you can actually work with a row of data inside of the for each row loop. And what I want to do is actually in this column multiply the customer ID by 3, so and then save it in this particular column. Again, it has absolutely no real life purpose, to our demonstration here. But the real life purpose that I am trying to demonstrate here with this little activity that we're going to do with this new column is the ability to manipulate data inside of a for each row loop, which can become a very powerful feature. Obviously, we need to tell it again what data table are we adding this new column to. Obviously, this being the customers table. Those are the only 2 values that we have to worry about here. Notice all the options are similar to what we had inside of our activity before. So our type argument here, let's go ahead and make this a int32 value. So what type of data is going to be stored in this column? In this case, I told you we're going to multiply by 3. So let's go ahead and store it as an integer value. And at this rate, we haven't done anything with our data table yet. So we need to go back into our for each row loop. Let's bring in a assign activity here. In the assign, I want to put this above the right line inside the body, but above the right line that we did a minute ago. What I want to be able to demonstrate here again is how can you manipulate data that's inside of a for each row loop. The way this is done is if I do row dot item, open the parenthesis here, the item is referring to the column name. I want to refer to my new column and recall it was customer ID times 3 in quotes. So almost think of this as our dictionary to a point. Recall dictionary, you know, we had a key value. In this case, it's the column of our table. And a very similar type syntax to what we were doing when we worked with dictionaries. What this is saying is inside of our row, specifically look at the customer ID times 3 column. And what we want to do here is take our customer ID. So row dot item customer ID and multiply by 3, so times 3. You'll notice we have an error here, and it's complaining that it does not like the multiply by 3. So what we need to do here is typecast that value right here. So converting that to an integer officially and then multiplying it by 3. As soon as we hit OK here, it is now happy. So what this is going to do is take whatever the customer ID value is for every row and multiply it by 3 and place it in our new column here of customer ID times 3. And to demonstrate this a bit more, let's go ahead and add this to our output here. So doing what we did a moment ago, do a plus dash quote plus to concatenate in this case, I want to say row. I could say customer ID times 3, that to string. I could also say again, row dot item, kind of redundant, I suppose. Row dot item, then open parenthesis, and then column name being customer ID times 3, and hit OK. Either one appears to be a viable option. So if I run my automation again, I should have that value multiplied by 3 on each of the customer IDs. And type in the customer ID. Yes, let's see. Yep, I typoed here. It's not row.item customer. This one should be no, yeah. Made a mistake here. No, customer ID, that's right. Customer ID times 3. So we've got all the values there. That looks correct. Everything's looking right here. See, here we go. I have a customer, I misspelled customer here, it looks like. Again, you got to pay very close attention to detail right there. And there is our results. One little typo like that will cause you nightmares. So great example, lesson learned for everybody there. Make sure the column names are an exact match. Otherwise, you'll get some bizarre errors as we just experienced right there. So if you look closely at our output, you'll notice 0 times 3 is 0, 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2, 6, 3 times 3, 9, 3 times 4 being 12, and 3 times 5 being 15. So you can see, again, the demonstration here, obviously the actual data has 0 relevance to anything, but the concept that I was trying to demonstrate here, plus having the typo of our column name, was the ability of adding a new column, and more importantly, inside of a for each row, the ability to actually update the data live time as you're in the midst of looping through each and every single record. So that's the important value at that moment in time. The next activity that I want to introduce everybody to is the ability to join two separate data tables, yet related data tables together. And in order to do this, we need to build another data table. So I want to do this immediately underneath the existing for each row loop. So I can obviously bring in the build data table, or one of the other things that I don't think I've demonstrated too much to this point is the ability of clicking on these little plus buttons. So I wanted to make sure I was at the bottom of the for each loop. Notice I clicked on it, following those blue lines down. I want to make sure I'm outside the loop right after it, so I can hit the little plus button here. As I do that, I can begin to type in build data table. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice the activity shows up at this point in time. Doing like we did earlier, I'm going to go a little bit faster through this one since we just completed this activity a moment ago. I want to create a new data table. So inside of our data table here, DT underscore, I'm going to call this one customer addresses. Or customer, how about customer address? And hit enter. You'll notice it's now added the new data table as a data table to my list. I want to now go into data tables. Remember exactly what we had before. Thank you, UiPath, for helping me here, but I'm going to build my own table. So remove the row, delete the columns. And what I want to have in this table here is a customer address for the records that we have in the previously built customer data table. So obviously the first column that we need is customer ID. Recall this was defined as an integer. We are not going to auto increment this column here because we're going to reference the column that is in the customer table above. So I'm not going to worry about the rest of the detail down below here. Other than obviously unique, that does make sense there. And in this case, I do not need to auto increment. And obviously I could take the allow null off. This needs a value. Add a new column. This is going to be street address. What street do they live on? Obviously this is going to be of type string. I'll leave everything defaulted. Add another column here. What city do they live in? Go ahead and do everything defaulted again. City, state, what state do they live in as a string? And then last but not least, what zip code? And obviously you could arguably say integer. I'm going to leave this one as a string. those last two columns I could have, I'm not going to, but obviously a zip code, if we're going to be, forced United States only, we could argue that we could set the max length to 5 because all zip codes are at least 5 characters. If you wanted to make sure it was, zip plus 4, if it had a dash, obviously you'd need 10 characters, dash plus 4 more. I'm not going to get into those details here, but those are, additional things that you could put in place here. What I want to do here is be a bit selective on the records that I put into the data. I don't want, from a demonstration point of view, I want to make sure that I don't match every record 100% what was in the other table. So the first customer ID I want to put in here is 0. I want to say they live at 123 Main Street in somewhere Missouri, 63368. Going into my next one, customer ID of 3. They live at 321 Elm Street. Say downstate Illinois, 62521. And just one more record here. Number 4, we'll say 1 Park Place and Mid-State, Illinois, 61705. Obviously, there's fewer addresses than there are records in the original customers table. That's fine. We're going to do a demonstration of exactly what that looks like. So at this point, go ahead and hit OK. We've now built our customer address data table. So now we've got 2 data tables in our app, one that holds customers, the other one that holds customer addresses. And at this point, we need to be able to connect these 2 tables. That's why we built this new table. You'll notice there is in our list of activities here, if we do data table, you'll see that there is a join option. Join data tables right here. Combines rows from 2 tables by using value that are common to each other using a join rule. So if anybody's familiar with working with SQL, how do you join 2 tables together? That's how this logic works. So if you're an SQL guru, this should be a bit of a repeat. And for those that are not, you're about to learn something pretty cool and interesting. So works slightly different, so that you definitely don't need to be an SQL expert in order to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish here. There are quite a few properties here. The goodness is we can handle all these properties inside the join wizard here, so I'm not going to concern myself with the activities here, but right underneath the build data table for our customer addresses, I brought in the join data table activity immediately underneath. I want to open up the join wizard. The way the join wizard works is we have to think in context of left and right. We have a left table and a right table. And the left table is table 1 and the right table is table 2. And then this output data table is ultimately going to be the merged, or the new table that has the 2 tables combined together. So what I'm going to do on the left side, I want this to be my customers table, so I can immediately start typing in here. You'll notice it allows me to select my customers data table. The right side table I want to be customer addresses, so the new data table that we just created. The join type, this is where SQL begins to come into play a little bit. So if you're not an SQL guru, again, no need to become immediately concerned, but if you know standard SQL, this join type is the exact same as what you would have in SQL. So let me briefly walk through a inner join. What this is going to do, it's going to only connect on records that are in common to both table 1 and table 2. So both left side and right side only bring back records that match, where they share the same linked values together. A left join type allows me to bring 100% of the records from, in this case, the customers table, the left side table, table 1. It'll give me 100% all the records that are there, and anywhere you can find a match on the right side, go ahead and make those connections. If we do a full, it's going to bring back data regardless of how they match on both sides. If the record doesn't match on one side, it'll be left on the right side, or the right side and vice versa. And anywhere that there is a common connection, we'll see those commonly connected records come to a head. In this case, I want to do a left. We know that we've got 100% of customers and only a subset of addresses. So go ahead and give me all the customers back and connect where you can on customer addresses. If I would have done a inner join, we would lose the customers that we don't have addresses for. And the way this works is down here in the column names, we need to be able to specify customer ID, the name of the column, where they equal, where the two columns are the same. Customer ID. You've got the ability to make various connections here depending on what it is your automation is trying to do. And majority of the time, you're probably going to have these to where they equal. So table 1, the customer ID from the customers table, where it equals, or it's the same as the customer ID in our customer addresses table, is what this statement here is talking about. Again, on a left join, I want to put this in a new or a third data table so we don't lose any of the data tables that we've built to this point. You do have the ability to override and replace one of your current data tables if you so choose. So I could say DT customers. It would do all these calculations here and then put the results right back in DT customers in this example. I do not want to do this. I want to go ahead and preserve the data that I currently have and create a new or a third data table, and I can do a control K here. You notice it's a set variable. It's allowing me to create a new variable on the fly here. DT underscore data table again. I want to call this one join table and hit enter. And as soon as I hit enter, it immediately put the new variable in the list down here below, and go ahead and hit OK. You'll notice as I do that, it's automatically filled out the properties window for me. There's nothing more I need to do here. So the customers table, the address table, a left join, then send the results back to the DT joined table. So at this point, we need to do a little bit of cleaning up. Obviously, we've got that goofy multiply by 3 column that we had a moment ago. We don't need that in our data any longer. Obviously, it was kind of goofy and it was more from a demonstration perspective. Notice we've got the ability here to remove a data column. I want to bring this activity in right underneath join data tables. So notice here, remove data column. What column do I want to remove? Just to make sure I don't make the same mistake again, I want to go up to my add data column. I'm going to copy the column name for the column that I added down here on the bottom. It's really reversing the process. What's the column name? Explicitly that way. The difference here, though, is remember we did the join. It's taken that column from the customers table, joined it with the addresses table. I want to remove it from the joined table here. So with that said, this column technically still exists in the customers table should I need it. In this case, I'm only removing this column from our joined table. And a couple more activities here. The last one really as it pertains to data tables that I want to discuss here is this ability to filter a data table. Being able to, if anybody's familiar with using the filter row or filter auto filter inside of Excel. That's what this capability is allowing us to do inside of a data table inside of UiPath Studio. So filter data table here, and if we, same idea, if we use the wizard, all the properties on the right should be handled for us. What this is saying is, what data table do you want to filter on in this first box here? Input data table. In this case, DT underscore our joined table. And majority of the time, you're able to use the same value here. Yet again, unless you're wanting to preserve, I could do another Control K here and send the data to a, in this case, what would be a fourth data table. I can, in this case, I don't have a need to do that. So I want to take the existing table, filter out some results, and put it right back in the same table again. So that's why you're seeing the input and the output. It's where is the data coming from? And after it's done filtering, where should the data go? In this case, go ahead and put it right back in the same data table again, albeit in its new filtered state. The question that I want to ask here is, what customer accounts are late? So we're calling our customer data table. We had a column in there called is account late. I want to keep those rows that are checked. So that's where this, you can kind of do this one of two ways. You can either remove based on the condition that you set, or you can keep the value that you're wanting to do. In this case, the column name was is account late. Similar to what we did on the join, it needs to be equal. In this case, give me the records that are all true, which would imply anybody that had a false status for their is account late, those records were now going to be removed when they get added to this join table. Go ahead and click OK here. You'll notice everything has been set based on the filter data table. And in order to see the results, the last little activity that I want to introduce everybody to is the ability to export data tables into Excel spreadsheets. And the first activity that we need here is one called Excel Application Scope. I want to bring this in right underneath the filter data table. You'll notice it's asking what the path to the workbook is. We don't have one right now. What I'm going to do is simply say results.xlsx. You need the file extension here. By doing this with a relative path, what it's going to do on our project, it's going to put the spreadsheet right next to the main.xaml file here, since we're not setting a explicit path here. Inside of, it's a mistake I make all the time too. Notice I was looking for an activity and I'm on the project tab. Got to go back to activities, and I want to look for the ability to do a right range. If I bring this into the do, you'll notice here it's wanting us to specify a data table. So DT underscore joined table. What this is going to say is put the data table on a sheet called sheet 1 and start it off in the top far left corner. Column A, row 1. So if I save and run my automation here, there's my same output, but one thing you're going to notice here, I'm now going to have Excel that showed up on my other monitor. Project is completed. And if I go back to project, I have to hit the little reload tab here. You'll notice I now have the spreadsheet that was generated here, results.xlsx. I should have my join data table, and I do. Notice I don't have headers though. That's something that I need to go back and change. But notice I've got the merge list here. And notice I do not have my multiply by 3 column. Obviously this is the customer ID from the address table. Notice the address table is this set of data here. Customer is on the left side here, A through D. Go ahead and click on the close here, say don't save. To get the columns in, if you click the Excel application scope here, I misstated that. The right range, sorry, hit the add headers option right here. So right range, add headers, if you put the checkbox here, rerun your automation again, you will have your header record. So at this point, if I open up results this time, there are my header records, all from hitting that one checkbox. But you'll see here, notice Steve Smith does not have a row. Recall we did not add a record for row 2. But since we did a left join, we're getting all the customers and only the addresses, obviously, as they match up for each. If you're curious to see the whole data table without the filter, what I want to do is do a right click and disable this for a minute just so I can see the whole list in an unfiltered state. So if I save and run again, we should now have the complete list in an unfiltered state. If I pull up results again, and there you go, there's the complete list. And again, the records that we don't have, we did not add records, so those records show up blank, only matching where we had values in our left join. Again, we can go a lot longer and a lot more depth and detail because there are a lot of activities that we're able to play around with. This demonstration here, no doubt, skims the surface of all of the, I should say all of it, it skims the surface of a subset of all of the activities that are available to us when it comes to manipulating and playing around with data tables. If you're curious as to what some of these other ones do, it's just a matter of doing a search for data table, see what's out here, hover over these activities, add them in, and manipulate the properties, or obviously some of them have the wizards accordingly to ensure that that particular activity is customized and configured correctly for whatever it is that your automation needs, require, and desire. So at this point, this concludes the tutorial for working with data tables inside UiPath Studio.